Welcome to the Hope Frequency, a space where faith meets mental health. I'm Renee Jacob, your host, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're navigating a season of struggle or wondering if faith and therapy can walk hand in hand, this show is for you. Let's tune in together. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hope Frequency. It has been 2 weeks since I launched an episode, and there is a reason for that. I'm coming back here to the studio after a while as well. I just felt like God saying that I need to slow down and I need to reconfigure the way I work and I'm approaching this. Um, Approaching creating content itself. And so it has been a time of contemplating many things. It has been a time of sitting with myself and dealing with parts of myself that I need to surrender to God. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why there was that break. But it is so good to be back. I'm so glad to be here. So, I don't know if you guys have come across that reel trend on Instagram. I think it was about a year ago, which said, almost forgot this is the whole point. And it would usually be clips of family or people doing things that they love and just recognizing what the point of, life is. And I kind of feel like God brought me to that point of asking myself, like, what is the point of this podcast? And what is the point of me doing what I do? And so, yeah, I've been sitting with a lot of big questions, good questions. And I realized I can chill a little bit. Like these episodes can be a lot more conversational because and I'll tell you why I started thinking that way. I was having a conversation with a friend. Her name is Joni. And I was asking her, what she thinks about the episodes and things like that. And she was sharing that she usually listens to the episodes when she's working out. And I thought that was so interesting. And then another friend told me that she listens to the episodes while she's cooking. I almost forgot that I'm talking to someone on the other end of the screen. And so, yeah, I think I want to just take it down a notch in terms of just being myself a little bit more. Of course, sharing quality content, but maybe bringing in a little bit more of myself and not making it seem like it's a class. Yeah. And so if this episode's going to look a little different, you'll this is probably why. And so today's topic is all about people pleasing. Now, that's a word we've heard a gazillion times, and we probably have our own understanding and our own definition of it. Um, in just a little bit, I'm going to share how people pleasing follows a sequence in the brain. And while thinking about sequences, what came to mind was the conversation that usually flows between me and someone who is asking me what I do for a living. So it's usually, what do you do? And I go, I am a psychologist. And even before the word leaves my mouth, the other person's going, are you reading me right now? Are you reading my mind right now? Can you read my mind? Can you tell what I'm thinking? And I'm just like, oh, no. And so that's a sequence that just happens so naturally. And honestly, guys, if you ever have friends who are therapists or counselors, we don't have the bandwidth to analyze people all the time and we cannot read people's minds. But I love it. I love every time that interaction ensues. Um, but as much as I don't analyze and study my friends and family, I do love analyzing characters in shows I watch. I think in the first episode, I mentioned that I really love watching like shows and movies and um, what was the other one? Yeah, true crime docuseries. And one of my favorite shows is The Office. No matter what I'm feeling, I can just sit and binge watch it because, I mean, come on, it is an epic show. Okay. And in that show, of course, we have Michael Scott, our main character, who is textbook people pleaser, right? He will do anything to, you know, get people's approval. He will do anything to avoid conflict and his tendency to make promises that he cannot keep, like promising the Scranton kids college tuition. That episode was hilarious. Um, and so while I was watching the show, I was just thinking about how He is an excellent example of people pleasing. And yeah, I was just wondering if you guys could share any characters, be it in movies or shows, that you've watched, is any character who's a picture of people pleasing, right? If there is anyone that you've noticed or identified, like, just drop it in the comments. I'd love to, you know, see what you think about it. While preparing for this topic, I thought I'd approach it the traditional way of, looking at definitions of people pleasing and the characteristics. And yes, we're going to cover all of that. But in the research, the thing that blew my mind was this incredible fact about the brain when it comes to people pleasing. Did you know that the brain learns a sequence, just like a computer learns code when it comes to people pleasing? Over time, the brain catches on to a series of events that reinforce and strengthen people pleasing. It's also why it's one of those things that is so unhelpful. And most of us are like, oh my gosh, I'm a people pleaser. I want to change. And yet, it's so hard to break out of it, right? And so I want to approach the topic of people pleasing through the lens of how the brain works and what really is going on up here when we engage in something like people pleasing. And so we're going to look at a couple of examples of what people pleasing can look like in our day to day lives. Maybe a friend asks you for a favor when there's already a lot on your plate, or a colleague is asking you to help out with their work when you're already falling behind, or a friend's expression shifts towards disappointment when you hesitate to say yes to something, or when you don't agree with them, or even when a partner responds in a tone that is probably a little sharper than usual. In these moments, a very specific internal tension arises. Your mind begins scanning what could have possibly gone wrong. And before you could logically evaluate each of these requests and ask yourself how you actually want to respond, you find yourself saying yes. You find yourself agreeing, apologizing, or rushing to smooth over the situation in order to maintain the peace. And later, the same question always follows: why did that happen so quickly, right? If you consciously intended to respond differently because you've caught yourself people pleasing before, why did that same reflex happen again? Now, you've got to think of the brain as a supercomputer, one that is constantly running in the background, tracking patterns, logging responses, and quietly deciding which ones are worth repeating. And what research reveals about this process tells us something important. Habits are not accidents. They are the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. And so it's fascinating how quickly that word yes appears in a particular situation, despite you not having the time or the energy, and despite you really, really wanting to say no. When a response is repeated like that many number of times, the brain does not just remember it. Over time, it starts to build a pathway that makes that reaction easier to repeat. And through years of repetition, what began as a choice has now been physically transformed into an automatic neural pathway. Over time, the brain becomes remarkably efficient at repeating the patterns that it has practiced the most. People pleasing has less to do with your personality and more to do with how your brain builds habits. So the next time you catch yourself thinking that you're just a natural people pleaser, this becomes a point for you to counter and sit with. And so, just to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the understanding of people pleasing, I'm just going to share a little bit about it. People pleasing is when you put everyone else's feelings and needs first, even at your own expense. It is where the version of you that has walked into the room has already been edited and filtered with the question, who do I need to be right now for this person to approve of me? And so, if you've ever said yes when you meant no, worked hard to keep everyone around you comfortable while quietly falling apart on the inside, or felt guilty the moment you put your own needs above anyone else, this episode is for you. Today, we're going to understand the many layers of people pleasing, not just the watered down version of being too nice. We're going to look at what it is and what it isn't, and why that distinction is so important. We're also going to explore whether people pleasing is something that we were handed by our culture and the place that we grew up in, and by what it means to be a good Indian son or daughter in a community that prizes harmony and selflessness above almost everything else. And then we're going to trace it back to childhood because most of these habits don't begin with us as adults. And don't forget to stick around till the end because we're going to look at the neuroscience of people pleasing. What exactly happens in our brains when we engage in people pleasing? And this is exciting to me because this is not just a habit that we can think our way out of, but it is a really strong, what to say, it's a really well established neural pathway, a deeply worn groove in our brain. And really understanding that changes the way we approach healing because then we're able to use the right tools to deal with something like people pleasing. By the end of this episode, I really hope that you'll be able to walk away with more information about this topic, as well as language for something that you've experienced but didn't really know how to put into words. I'd also encourage you to extend grace to yourself in sitting with this question of how you can live boldly, joyfully, and freely, becoming the version that God intended you to be and not the version that you think everyone else around you wants you to be. And so, one of the things I like to do when I'm trying to understand a new concept or idea is to be able to sit with what it is, but also to be able to sit with what it isn't. Because to understand what it isn't gives you more clarity about the idea itself, right? And so, wherever you are right now, if you can just take a minute and just write down what is your understanding of people pleasing. If you are not in a position to write, just bring to mind what your understanding of people pleasing is. Okay. And so, what do people pleasers do? They will say yes when they mean no. They will hide how they really feel and work really, really hard to keep the peace. All because they're afraid that if they don't, people will get upset, pull away, or stop liking them. Take the example of Michael Scott itself. He worked so hard to keep the peace at the workplace, and he is terrified of confronting anybody, terrified of making those hard decisions because he does not want to lose anybody's approval. And so, even when he has to fire someone, he just delegates it to Dwight, delegates it to whoever, and says, I don't want to deal with it because I'm the good guy. I want to play good cop always so that everyone likes me. And the interesting thing about that example and about how people pleasing shows up for us is that it's often mistaken for empathy or kindness when it is anything but that. The truth is, people pleasing does not come from a place of genuine care. It comes from a place of need, a deep fear of being rejected, the need to be loved, and the need for approval, as well as the anxiety that if you don't keep everyone around you happy, something bad's going to happen either to you or to the relationship that you share with that person. It is where we fall into a pattern of giving more than we have because we believe that's the only way of being worthy of their love. And so, a quick side note here, people pleasing is actually rooted in niceness and not in kindness. And yes, there is a difference between the two. And I think, especially in Christian spaces, especially in the church, we are constantly encouraging each other to be kind. But I think the conviction here is to ask ourselves, am I being kind or am I being nice? Niceness is often a response designed to prevent tension. The goal is to avoid discomfort, smooth over disagreements, or make sure that everyone remains satisfied. In many ways, niceness operates as a social performance just to keep the peace. I know I've been nice on many an occasion. And I think while I was reading this, it helped me sit and pause and ask myself what the difference is. Kindness, on the other hand, functions quite differently. It still involves care for others, but it does not require you to abandon your own needs and your own boundaries. It is when you're helpful, respectful, or supportive while also maintaining a clear sense of personal boundaries. Niceness tends to be driven by fear of conflict. Kindness is guided by values. The other thing to really keep in mind here is that the opposite of people pleasing is not self love. And I know this sounds almost like a very controversial line. Self love is one of those things that is just thrown around everywhere. And I think as Christians and as children of God, we get access to a higher kind of love. Um, to be able to recognize that God loves you, to be able to receive that love, and to live in the truth of who you are and love yourself knowing who you are. in and through Christ. That's what it means to love ourselves, not the self love that secular spaces keep propagating all the time. Now, here's the thing, people pleasing can also look sacrificial. It can look like love and respect. But the truth is that we are always expecting something in return. We're expecting their acceptance, their seal of approval, their validation, and their support. And here's the third dimension to people pleasing, it is an attempt to control someone's perception of you. It disguises itself as kindness or selflessness, but it is actually a learned response from childhood. It really is rooted in a deep desire for acceptance, approval, and belonging. And so it isn't necessarily genuine care for others, but really about managing how people see you. You're then operating from a space of fear rather than authenticity. And so let's very quickly go through some of the characteristics of people pleasing. One, of course, is difficulty in saying no and setting boundaries. And so, to quickly explain what a boundary is, it is a limit you set that defines what is okay and not okay for you um, in a relationship or a situation. It communicates your needs, values, and capacity to others, what you're available for and what you're not. Boundaries are not about controlling other people's actions. Boundaries are not requests. It is, um, it is a boundary is basically what you are going to do in that situation, and it is you focusing on your actions and your decisions in that situation. I'm just explaining it so that all of us are on the same page. Anyway, moving on to the second characteristic, it's when we give our time, energy, and resources to others, even when it depletes our own well being. When we apologize for things that are not our fault, just so that we can smooth things over with people. When you feel guilty for your actions or decisions that displease others. When you sacrifice your own peace to appease someone. When you adapt your personality depending on the social environment that you are in. Or when we become perfectionists, because if we can be perfect, we are sure that others would view us favorably. And the last one is when we experience a disconnect from our authentic selves, when we basically become what others need to the extent that we don't even remember who we are and what we need. A quick note on what the authentic self is. It is the truest version of yourself, the version that exists underneath all the performance, the one that knows what you actually feel, what you actually need, what you actually believe, and what you actually want before the fear gets a chance to edit that part of you. And so now we're going to look at how the culture that we're brought in has an impact and an influence, often reinforcing people pleasing itself, especially in a context like ours, especially in a country like ours. People pleasing is often reinforced, celebrated, and culturally appropriated as well. And so I want to start off with an example from one of the classics of all times, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum. I don't know how many of you have watched it. And in that, we know the main character, Rahul, spends years trying to be the perfect son, trying to uphold the family's prestige, trying to do everything right in his father's eyes to get his father's approval above all else, even at the cost of his own dreams and what he wants, even at the cost of making authentic decisions for himself, right? And so we see him excelling academically, being that overachiever, overperformer, just to be able to get the support and acceptance of his family. I think he's a great example of a people pleaser because and I think the movie itself gives us quite a bit of insight on how the culture that we grow up in really shapes the people that we become. And so people pleasing can be conditioned and even reinforced by the culture that we're brought up in. And especially in a culture like ours, keeping the peace isn't just polite, it's expected. We're taught to adjust and be happy with what we have and do anything but inconvenience people. I'm sure all of us have heard the standard lines in our own homes, in our own Indian family contexts, where we're really taught to adjust and accommodate and make sure that everybody else is happy, even to the point of discouraging ourselves from voicing our needs or what we want, because that is termed as selfish, right? And so saying no to someone can easily be read as rude, selfish, or disrespectful. And we're taught from a very young age that a good person puts others first, even at their own expense. And that is a sign that you've been raised well, a sign of maturity and responsibility. And I think in a country like India, it goes one step further because it also becomes a moral duty or an obligation that we have to perform in society. Accommodating others and putting others first is not just seen as good behavior, but it is seen as necessary for you to have a good standing in your family and in the society that you grow up in. And so, really, when we people please in the Indian context, where it's not seen as a problem, but it is seen as you being a good person. The other thing to note here is that people pleasing is also heavily gendered in a context like ours. Girls are often socialized at a very young age to demonstrate empathy, cooperation, and emotional sensitivity. And there can even be certain qualities like assertiveness or expressing disagreement that receive far less social approval. And so, very early on, the women of our country are learning that it is easier to keep the peace, easier to go with what everybody else wants. And it's also why we see it so often in the circles that we're in. Like, I think I was having a conversation with my friends, and we were talking about how um, the men in our group or the boys in our group are very comfortable, and very clear about what they want and what they don't want. But with the girls, there's always that confusion. There's always that blur in terms of, okay, are you really speaking your mind, or are you just saying something to make sure that everybody is okay and everybody is happy? And the distinction is something that caught my attention. And it's also something that I've been noticing. And I think this episode will also resonate with a lot more women than men because it is what we because it is what shows up more often in women. And so over time, all of these patterns are reinforced, and it creates that internalized expectation that relational harmony comes before personal needs. And in other words, many Indian women were never taught that their no was valid, but instead were taught that a good woman keeps the peace. And the other thing is, compliance actually gets rewarded in our context. You see, when accommodating behavior is constantly reinforced, or basically met with love and approval or belonging, it can become crystallized across contexts. And so I'm sure you must have seen this in your own homes or in your own spaces as well. Every time you just say yes, keep the peace, every time you're just sort of shrinking into the corner and not voicing your opinions too loudly, everybody's happy, everybody's pleased. Decisions are being made for you, you are being told what to do, and everybody feels great, right? And so you see that compliance is often rewarded and reinforced. And so we often think that choosing to not people please, especially in our homes, is wrong, when that's not true. People pleasing, especially when it comes to our parents, and I think I'm going to do a different episode on that, but people pleasing when it comes to our parents is actually on some levels idolatry, because it is you saying what my parents think about me and what they want for my life is greater than what God thinks of me and what He wants for my life. Now, I'm not saying that we should disobey our parents, and I'm not saying we should dishonor them. The Bible has clear commandments on that. But it is important to recognize that everything that we've discussed so far, right? That people pleasing comes across as niceness, it comes across as respect. These are things that we need to check for ourselves and ask, am I really operating from a space of surrender to God, or am I making decisions in my life just to keep the peace at home? And so every time you said that yes, and things went smoothly, your brain has nicely filed that away as evidence that has worked. And so the same pattern repeats over and over again. Ultimately, it's important to recognize that people pleasing is not just behavior, but it's also identity. Behavior that was initially learned as a context specific response has eventually integrated into who we become, which is why most of us go, oh yeah, I'm just a textbook people pleaser. Like I've just always been that way. And yeah, I think it's quite hard to change right now. And honestly, it isn't something that we just do, but it ultimately integrates into who we become. And that's why we need to sort of create that check for ourselves. The last thing that I want to sort of recognize when it comes to people pleasing in our Indian context, in our cultural context, is that it can be so exhausting. People pleasers are excellent predictors and scanners. And what I mean by that is that they often engage in what researchers call hermeneutic labor, which is constantly predicting and managing how other people feel. I'm sure some of you can relate to this. You step into a group or you step into a space, and your instant thing is to be able to scan, okay, who is where? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? Are they thinking something about me? Are we okay? Or I think specifically in your own group, in your own close groups, or in your own family spaces, you're probably scanning and wondering, okay, why did that person say it that way? Like, why was his tone like that? Is he mad at me? Is she upset with me? Oh my gosh, did I just disappoint them? We're constantly scanning and constantly seeing how everyone's feeling and where everyone's at. And that's what hermeneutic labor is. And we think that it's just one of those things that we naturally do. But what it really is doing is your brain constantly scanning in the background, and it can be extremely exhausting. It is additional mental load on your brain. And so, yeah, I cannot tell you the number of times that I've had clients and even friends talk about how frustrating and draining and exhausting it is to constantly engage in people pleasing. And that's exactly why we need to be having this conversation. So, now we're going to talk a little bit about the root of people pleasing, because, like we discussed at the beginning, it isn't just something that we picked up as adults. It isn't just behavior that we randomly engage in, but it is something that has specifically evolved in and through childhood experiences. And so, I want you to picture the silent child, the peacemaker of the home, the one who doesn't cause any trouble, or the one who is so adjusting and does not have too many strong opinions of their own. Who is that child? And why did that child become the way they are? That child learned that the safest thing they can do is to make sure everyone around them is okay by keeping the peace, by keeping quiet, by not speaking their minds, by doing what everybody else wants them to do. Not because they're naturally concerned for people all the time, but because in their home, keeping others happy was how they stayed out of trouble, how they got love, and maybe even how they survived. And so when children grow up in extremely stressful or unsafe environments with overly critical caregivers, or in homes where self expression is discouraged, where their feelings and needs weren't welcome, they don't just get sad, they adapt. They develop ways of coping that help them get through, but costs them a great deal. And so, what are the ways of coping? It's what we call insecure coping mechanisms. Let me explain what that is. So, one of the common ways in which this shows up is learning very early on to read the room, to guess what other people need even before they ask, to put other people's feelings first, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. And over time, this can even look like being hypervigilant to other people's moods, suppressing your own emotions, constantly seeking approval and validation, being excessively focused on taking care of others, and desperately wanting closeness in relationships while quietly surrendering your own needs and well being for its sake. And most importantly, becoming a version of yourself that fits into the mold that pleases the person that's just before you, which means that you are constantly changing, you are constantly becoming different versions of yourself, and you're turning into the person that the other person wants to see or be around, rather than being the authentic person that God created you to be. And so, what happens to these kids that grow up in overly strict homes with critical caregivers who expect them to always follow the family rules and fit into society? They grow up becoming incredibly confused, insecure, and uncomfortable in who they are because they believe that ev- because they believe that wherever they go, people are supposed to like them. And if people don't like them and don't approve of them, then they're doing something wrong. And then it's the whole loop all over again. What also happens to these children is that their sense of independence, their self worth, and even their confidence takes a beating. And so, what happens when a child loses trust in themselves? They start looking outward for a sense of safety. They stop asking, what do I need? And start asking, what does everyone else need me to be? Who does everyone else need me to become? Sadly, this habit rarely stays in childhood. It follows each of us almost inevitably into adulthood, shaping how we work, how we love, how we are in relationships, how we think, how we make decisions as well. It unfortunately creates an unconscious belief that keeping others happy is what earns them care, safety, and love. And so, a good question to sit with right now is to be able to ask yourself how your people pleasing shows up and where it shows up the most. Like which relationship or which context it shows up the most. And then you get to ask yourself, what need is that people pleasing trying to meet? Right? And so if you want to pause the video at this point, take a couple of minutes to just sit and reflect on that, you can do that. All right. And so this part ties into how we started the episode, that people pleasing has a specific neural sequence in the brain that we need to understand. And what we're going to explore a little bit today is something known as neural highways. And so, what we need to keep in mind is that when a response is repeated many times, for example, saying yes to something even though you don't have the bandwidth, the brain does not just remember it. Over time, it starts to build a pathway that makes the same reaction easier to repeat. And so, a helpful way is to be able to picture the brain as a landscape. If you walk across a field once, the grass will bend exactly where you step and then fold back up, right? But if you walk the same route every day, it almost starts to form a trail. The path gets clearer, and you're able to see that at this point, it's that much more easier to take that particular path because there is a pathway that is opened up. Interestingly enough, the brain works in a very similar way. And so each time the same reaction happens, all the neurons involved strengthen their connection with each other. We'll get to what are the neurons that sort of fire together. But it actually brings to mind this particular line that says neurons that fire together wire together. And that's exactly what's happening here. So, what we need to understand is that it's the brain's job to solve problems. Like I shared before, the brain is a supercomputer, it's an efficient system, it's trying to constantly optimize, right? And so it is the brain's job to strengthen those pathways that solve problems. So let's understand this with an example, okay? Someone might have looked irritated, disappointed, or distant. Picture that for a second. What happens to your body? You're obviously reacting immediately. Your heart is probably palpitating. You're feeling uncomfortable. And your brain immediately detects that as a social threat. Now, here's the interesting part. If that tension that I just described disappeared after you agreed, apologized, or tried to smooth the situation over, the brain learned something very, very important. The brain learned an important sequence in that moment. A signal of tension appeared, your response followed, and then the tension disappeared. Because your response seemed to have solved the problem, the brain actually saves that pathway. And so the next time a similar moment appeared, the same response was activated more quickly. Over the years, repeating the sequence many times can turn that deliberate response into a habit. So now we've understood that when the same response is used again and again, the pathway connected to that behavior becomes stronger and easier to activate, right? But then the opposite also applies. What I mean by that is that the responses that are rarely practiced become weak and unfamiliar. And so, for example, if someone rarely set boundaries, the brain has very little practice using that pathway. The response may feel uncomfortable or difficult simply because it was not reinforced yet. Meanwhile, the pathway associated with restoring peace and harmony feel a lot more smooth and familiar. And so we're also more likely to resort to doing that because it is the more comfortable thing to do, and and because the brain is more familiar with doing that. So, so I'm going to share a little bit about what exactly happens in the brain when we people please. There are two important parts of the brain that get stronger when we engage in this particular habit. One is the social network of the brain. It's the part that is involved in empathy, in a theory of mind, which is basically thinking from another person's point of view and things like that. And the other one are the social reward pathways. And so essentially, both these parts of the brain are the ones that help us understand how other people feel, how we pick up on social cues, and even how we feel rewarded by connection. All of this is getting stronger now as we people please. It's the same pathways that light up when we show genuine care and kindness for others, which is part of why people pleasing is so hard to identify. It doesn't feel like fear, it feels like love. And there's a chemical reason for that. When we make someone happy or smooth over a conflict or win someone's approval, our brain releases oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine, all of the good chemicals connected to love, our sense of belonging, feeling good. And so, this biochemical reward, literally, our brain is rewarding or our brain is releasing certain hormones that reward this behavior, only reinforces it. And so people pleasing stops being a habit and it starts becoming something that we actually crave. The more we do it, the more natural and instinctive it feels until it stops feeling like a choice altogether. Now, a lot of studies have revealed that the neural circuits involved in assertiveness, decision making, or even prioritizing yourself become weakened because of infrequent usage, because we don't use those circuits as much. Now, what's interesting is in order to be assertive and in order to make sound logical and in order to make sound decisions, there are two parts of the brain involved: executive function and the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, the prefrontal cortex is right here. It's often known as the thinking part of the brain. It is the part responsible for higher order thinking and decision making. And when these pathways go largely unpracticed, processes like setting boundaries in social or professional settings becomes genuinely difficult. Not because the person is weak or a pushover or lacking in character, but simply because the brain hasn't been given enough opportunities to strengthen that circuit. And so, after a pattern has been repeated like that for so many years, people can start describing themselves as the kind of person who always helps or someone who simply hates conflict. It can begin to feel like it's part of our personalities. But in many cases, what feels like personality is actually a well practiced habit. The brain is simply repeating the pathway that it has used the most. All right. Even as we've unpacked what really happens in the brain, and if you're curious, you can read a little bit more about it, it can almost feel like our brains are against us, right? That it's sort of encouraging us to people please more, and it is true. I think it's really important to understand why it sort of reinforces itself and why it feels good and why it feels right um, to engage in people pleasing. But I think the good news here is that if the brain can learn something, the brain can also unlearn and relearn something. How incredible is it that God designed us that way, right? And so the same process that built the original pathway can build a new one. Each time a different response is practiced, even if it's awkward at first, whether it means setting a boundary or saying no or choosing to do something that's true to who you are versus who that person wants you to be, the brain begins strengthening a new set of connections. At the beginning, that path may feel unfamiliar and narrow. The old response may still feel easier, but with repetition, the new pathway gradually becomes stronger. And so, if we see it this way, the people pleasing reflex is not really a permanent trait. It is simply a pathway that was built through experience. And like any pathway in the brain, it can be reshaped. All right. I hope that wasn't too much of information. I've been trying to watch my own videos and see how I can, improve and simplify certain things. But I think it's been super encouraging to hear that some of these things are quite easy to understand. But yeah, let me know if it was information heavy or if you were able to sort of get a sense of everything that we shared. And so, just to quickly summarize, people pleasing is not a personality flaw. It is not proof that you are too weak or too sensitive or that you're incapable of having a backbone, but instead, it is a pattern, one that is specifically learned in a very specific environment, reinforced by a very specific culture, and etched into the brain through years and years of repetition. You didn't choose it. I think in many ways it chose you because at some point it did keep you safe. But here's what I want us to hold on to: the same brain that built those pathways can most definitely build new ones. And how does the brain do that? It is through something called neuroplasticity. It is a fantastic concept. It is really one of the wonders of the brain, and it gives us so much hope. It really is where hope is rooted when it comes to healing. What is neuroplasticity? It is the fact that the brain is capable of change, the fact that the brain is capable of learning, relearning, unlearning patterns because there are these neural connections that are constantly firing and reworking, and when new neural pathways are formed. Anyway, there's a lot more to it. I'll probably get into that in another episode. But basically, because God designed our brains to be neuroplastic, it is very much possible for us to unlearn some of these habits and patterns that have been unhelpful, things that we're carrying over from our past, things that served us when we were younger, but don't serve us anymore. Neuroplasticity is our path to healing. Healing isn't simply about willpower or trying harder to convince yourself to say no next time, but really it's about slowly and consistently practicing a different response, something that we do in therapy. And we're going to explore what that looks like in the next episode as well. To be able to consistently practice that response until the new pathway becomes the easier one to take. And to quickly add here, from a faith based perspective, people pleasing at its core is rooted in the belief that your worth has to be earned. The fear of not being enough as you are, and seeking that external reinforcement to feel safe, secure, and worthy. And this becomes the limiting belief. This becomes the lie that we need to unlearn and really challenge. Your worth does not come from how others see you or their approval. Your worth comes from who God says you are and who you belong to. As children of God, we get to take a step further and acknowledge that our worth comes from our Creator who knows us best. And so I want to end with a quick closing question. Can you think or even find one or two verses in the Bible that speak of um, God's love for you? One of my favorite verses for that is Jeremiah 1, verse 5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And so before I let you go, I want you to sit with one thing. There have been many questions through this episode, but there's going to be one thought. It's not so much an activity, but it's more of something for you to ask yourself. Um, in the last 7 days, okay, in the last 1 week, um, has there been a moment or a situation where you ended up saying yes when you actually wanted to say no? I just want you to bring that to awareness. And the reason we're doing this is because we know that people pleasing is so automatic. It's so much of a reflex that often we're not even aware of it. And so I hope that you will be able to sit with that one. All right. And that is a wrap. This is the end of the episode. I'm so glad that you stayed till the very end and listened to me talk about many things. Honestly, this was a topic that I was super excited about because it was also the one that challenged and convicted me the most. I would definitely categorize myself as a people pleaser, and it has been one of the things that I've been actively working towards and unlearning. And so, yeah, if this episode resonated with you, do share it with a friend. Do leave a review, drop a comment on YouTube. I just realized you can't drop comments on Spotify. I've been happily saying that every episode. So you'll have to just text me on WhatsApp or Instagram. We have an Instagram handle as well. So I'll probably tag that in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. God bless. Be kind to yourself. And I hope that you have a fantastic week ahead. See you.